As an instructor, a question I have heard has been, why are we learning a different way of doing something we have been doing for a long time? Or what's wrong with the old way of doing things? Why did they change that? We will be looking at who they are and why some things were changed. Courses, classes, and drills are based on laws, rules, regulations, standards, best practices, experience, and common sense. To help in understanding changes, we will be looking at several documents. These documents will help better understand why some things have changed and why the changes are necessary. As an introduction to these documents, we will be looking at the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices. We will briefly discuss the MUTCD and what it is for, what it's meant to accomplish. We'll look at who's involved in putting the MUTC together. We'll also take a brief overview of the whole manual. We will look at some of the more recent changes that are applicable to us, and we will be looking closely at the requirements that the MUTCD has that we should be complying with. At the conclusion of this presentation, the student will be able to describe the basic intent of the MUTCD, be able to describe a temporary traffic control zone, list the various levels of compliance, list the components of a work zone, describe the three classifications of a roadway incident, describe the basic content of Part 6, and describe what a best practices are. A standard is a document that provides requirements, specifications, guidelines, options, support, or characteristics that can be used consistently to ensure that materials, products, processes, and services are fit for their purpose and are understandable no matter where it may be applied. For years, New York State promulgated its own traffic control manual. The federal government tied compliance to the national standard, the Highway Appropriations Funds. The Federal Highway Administration and the MUTCD allow for states to promulgate stricter or more comprehensive supplements. States may not pass regulations or standards that are lesser than the federal standard. We will be looking at the New York State supplement in later presentation. New York State finally adopted the MUTCD and included the New York State enhancements. It's important to remember that with most federal laws, states may enact stricter laws or regulations. The MUTCD contains the basic principles that govern the design and use of traffic control devices for all streets, highways, bikeways, and private roads open to public travel, regardless of the agency or the owner that has jurisdiction. Imagine the mess if the roadways off main highways into shopping centers and such had different markings, different lane widths, different signs, or no markings or signage at all. The MUTCD, therefore, is applicable to privately owned roads as well, as long as they are publicly accessible. It maintains a consistency no matter what roadway you're driving on. There are several agencies, organizations, and member groups that are involved in the development and the updating of the MUTCD. New York State Department of Transportation in the case of New York State. And then all of the other states have equal representation on this working group. The Federal Highway Administration, the American Association of Highway and Transportation Professionals, the American Association of State Highway Officials, the American Traffic Safety Services Association, and the Institute of Transportation Engineers. There are also many private sector members and participants, such as owners and operators of private roads, contractors and construction companies, sign and signal manufacturers, just to name a few. Briefly, the The MUTC was first adopted in 1927 by the American Association of State Highway Officials. The AASHO and the National Conference on Street and Highway Safety developed the original MUTCD in 1935. The Federal Highway Administration came into existence in 1967. In 1971, the Federal Highway Administration took over the administration of the MUTCD. What is called the Millennium Edition was adopted in 2000. Some major updates and additions were adopted as the 2003 edition. The current adopted edition is the 2009. There is a 2019 edition often referred to, but it is the 2009 edition with several updates and changes. There are 9 parts that make up the MUTCD. Part 1 is the general. It establishes the purpose, principles, and design of traffic control devices. The 15 subsections of Part 1 detail the placement, maintenance, and uniformity of traffic devices. Also set out the responsibility, authority, and many other details on roadway traffic control devices. To illustrate the details in the MUTCD, I have shown the chapter breakdown of Part 2, Signs. The example of Part 2, Signs, has 14 chapters with specific information, details, and requirements for highway and roadway signage. Each part has a number of subchapters, anywhere from 3 to 68. Part 3, Markings, sets the standard for all signs, markings, and symbols that are painted onto the roadway surfaces and curbs, such as a broken line, which we refer to as a dotted line. It's actually defined as a broken line. Center line of the highway are 10-foot segments with a 30-foot gap between the segments. A dotted line are 2-foot segments with a 2 to 6-foot gap depending on the use and the posted speed. It's also a dotted line can be a 3-foot segment with a 9-foot gap that designates lane lines. Part 4 is the highway traffic signals. This outlines traffic lights and similar lighted control devices. Part 5 is traffic control devices for low volume roads. Part 6 is temporary traffic control. Part 7 is traffic control for school areas. Part 8 is traffic control for railroad and light rail transit grade crossings. And Part 9 is traffic control for bicycle facilities. Don't worry, the chapter we'll be looking at is Chapter 5G, Temporary Traffic Control Zones. Part 5 is general and regulatory signs, warning signs, guide signs, markings, traffic control for highway grade crossings, temporary traffic control zones, and traffic control for school zones. We'll be looking at 5G, temporary traffic control zones. Don't get too excited. This really isn't anything new. We have been setting up areas similar to this for quite a while. There just wasn't a specific name and standard guidance on zone sizes, functions, and requirements. So 5G, we'll look at the introduction, which explains the general principles, the applications of where to use these, the different types of channelization devices, markings, and other signage, and other traffic control devices. We'll cover the specifics in Chapter 5 and in detail Section 5G in another presentation. Part 6, Temporary Traffic Control. Most of what we will be discussing throughout this and future presentations has a basis in Part 6. Chapter 6A is general. In the context of planned work zones and construction sites, public travel and worker safety are of equal importance. In emergency response, we will be placing responder safety above driver convenience. If Workers on a road construction project need to stop or slow down to allow for traffic flow. The only thing that suffers is the length of time to complete the road project. Emergency responders do not have the luxury of time. If motorists must be inconvenienced to allow for responders to safely and efficiently deal with trapped and injured victims, life safety always comes first. Chapter 6B is the fundamental principles of traffic control. The best ways to move traffic through the temporary traffic control zones. Formulating specific plans for temporary traffic control at traffic incidents is difficult because of the variety of situations that can arise. There are 7 fundamental principles of temporary traffic control. We will cover these 7 principles in detail in a future presentation. Chapter 6C, Temporary Traffic Control Elements. Traffic control elements, methods of moving traffic through temporary traffic control zones. So this is section 6C03, components of temporary traffic control zones. We'll take a look at their advanced warning area, the transition area, the activity area, and the termination area. In emergency traffic control, we add 1 or 2 buffer zones to these zones. Section 6C 113 and 6C14, 6C15 are procedures that are very seldom utilized in emergency temporary traffic control. Again, there is nothing new or different in this section than we are familiar with. This simply standardizes the functions currently used in emergency traffic control. (6D) Pedestrian and worker safety. Moving pedestrian traffic through zones safely. Pedestrians generally are not a problem, but may be of concern on many urban and suburban streets. We will translate worker safety to cover emergency responder safety. The primary difference is that in work zones, the driving public is given a higher level of importance. In emergency response, the priority is on responder and victim safety. Chapter 6C is flagger control. When traffic is managed and controlled by flaggers, this is what flaggers are expected to do. Section 6E04, 6E05, and 6E06 are usually not available to emergency responders. Automatic devices take time to set up and coordinate and tend to be expensive. Chapter 6F, Temporary Traffic Control Zone Devices. Quite an extensive list. Don't let it intimidate you. This is an extensive list of equipment, devices, markers, lights, and signs, and how they are to be used in temporary traffic control zone. This chapter also designates when and how these devices should be used. Several of the devices, signs, and markings are not available or utilized by emergency responders. Don't let the size of this list scare you. We will only be selecting those devices and signs and markings that are available to emergency responders. Chapter 6G, type of temporary traffic control zone activities. Suggested methods and procedures to use depending on where the significant work or activity area is located in relation to the roadway. Guides, procedures, and best practices based on the location of the emergency or work zone related to the roadway. Chapter 6H, typical applications. Detailed activities and deployment of the activities established in Chapter 6G. When, where, and how to use these. Chapter 6I, control of traffic through traffic incident management areas. Procedures that may be used based on the severity and duration of the incident management area. Minor traffic incidents are defined as less than 30 minutes, but 30 to 45 minutes works well for us as an average time on scene. Intermediate traffic incidents are 30 minutes to 2 hours. We try to keep our scene time to about an hour or so. Major traffic incidents lasting over 2 hours. We'll take a look at particularly the use of emergency vehicle lighting, something new that's been taken into the design and manufacture of firefighting and rescue vehicles. Traffic control devices, signals, signs, markings, work zone traffic control. Among other definitions detailed in the standards, the MUTC extensively covers traffic control devices. We are mainly concerned with signs and work zone traffic control. Our signage must comply with the sign standard established in the appropriate sections of the MUTCD. Our protocols, procedures, and traffic control activities should be based on the standards established in the MUTCD. We strive to keep our traffic control devices to meet minimum standards. With some devices, we try to exceed the minimum standards. The objectives are to make sure our signs are recognizable, consistent, uniform, and meet the driver's expectations. Driver expectations include simple, understandable, conspicuous, and easily understood. Traffic cones, for an example, 28-inch tall traffic cones are the standard for suburban roads, but 36-inch cones that are required on high-speed highways, such as expressways and throughways, are much more visible to motorists and can be used in the suburban and urban settings. Remember, your traffic control devices should fill a need, command attention, convey a clear and simple meaning, command respect, and provide adequate time for the drivers to respond. Recognizable, consistent, uniform. Must meet the driver's expectations. So in decision making, we look at what the compliance means. A standard is a requirement to comply. Standards must be followed. Guidance is a recommendation to comply. Options are permitted, and support is an informal statement. So a standard is a statement of required, mandatory, or specifically prohibited practice regarding a traffic control device. All standard statements are labeled, and the text appears in bold type. The verb shall is typically used. Remember, in standards, that the term shall means you will. The verbs should and may are not used in standard statements. Standard statements are sometimes modified by options. Standard statements shall not be modified or compromised based on engineering judgment or engineering study. A guidance is a statement of recommended but not mandatory practice in typical situations, with deviations allowed if engineering judgment or engineering study indicates the deviation to be appropriate. All guidance statements are labeled and the text appears in unbold type. The verb should is typically used. The verbs shall and may are not used in guidance statements. Guidance statements are sometimes modified by option. An option is a statement of practice that is a permissive condition and carries no requirement or recommendation. Option statements sometimes contain allowable modifications to a standard or guidance statement. All option statements are labeled and the text appears in unbold type. The verb may is typically used. The verbs shall and should are not used in option statements. Support is an informational statement that does not convey any degree of mandate. recommendation, authorization, prohibition, or enforceable condition. Support statements are labeled and the text appears in unbold type. The verbs shall, should, and may are not used in support statements. The 2009 revisions are basically 250 pages of changes, some major, some minor. Guidance for attaining approval to experiment with new devices. New devices, once designed, must be adequately tested to make sure that they function the way they are intended. A new chapter on traffic incident management, part 6, section 6I, was added, and in-street pedestrian signs. Remember, incident management is a term used in the MUTCD to define an emergency situation on, involving, or instructing a roadway. Some pedestrian hybrid beacons, we're seeing more and more of this. Mid-block crosswalks are being installed. For years, the crosswalks were, according to the MUTCD, were installed at intersections from corner to corner. Now we're seeing more and more crosswalks and pedestrian access walks installed mid-block between the intersections. We're used to seeing the crosswalks at the intersections, but pedestrians who may not be able to or may not want to walk to the nearest intersection, mid-walk crosswalks are being installed. This has an effect on where our pedestrians may be if that becomes a concern in traffic control. Some of the other revisions, their signs are being replaced or redesigned using pictographs and symbols replacing the wording, as wording may not be in the language of the driver, such as high occupancy vehicle lanes, HOV. Some of the other revisions are new colors for HOV lanes, colors for toll pass lanes, purple for Easy Pass for those of you that have an Easy Pass, new signage, pictographs, new symbols, and new markings that are understandable regardless of the language of the driver. Now, toll roads and roads within shopping centers, airports, sports arenas, theme parks, and similar businesses or recreational facilities that are privately owned, but the public is allowed to travel without access restrictions. That means privately owned roads must comply with the MUTCD. Imagine the confusion if you're coming off of a major road and then onto a private road into a private parking lot of a large business, and the signage was different, the roadway widths were different, or there were no signage or any indications at all. This allows for consistency no matter where the public is allowed to travel. The signage and the requirements and the standards are all the same. What we'll be looking at in the future, particularly we're going to look at the MUTCD Part 5, Chapter 5G, the temporary traffic control zone, the applications and channelization devices, how to safely and effectively move vehicles from different lanes of travel, the markings required to do that, and other control devices that may be available for the temporary traffic control zones. We'll look at the MUTCD Part 6, Temporary Traffic Control. We'll discuss the 7 fundamental principles in detail and the elements of a traffic control, pedestrian and worker safety, flagger control, temporary traffic control zone devices, temporary traffic control zone activities, and the applications for those activities, and the control of traffic through the incident management area. Remember, the incident management area is MUTCD speak for an emergency scene. So in summary, Manual of Uniform Traffic Control Devices 2009 edition is well over 865 pages. With some of the new additions, it's closer, almost 1,000 pages. It sets the national standard for all public accessible roadways in the United States. That includes not only city streets and governmental run highways and roadways, but privately owned streets and parking lots as well. Our emphasis will be on Part 5, Chapter 5G, temporary traffic control zones, and Part 6, temporary traffic control. Are there any questions? Remember, I will include my email address. If you have any questions, you can email me. We'll do our best to answer any questions you may have. So I bid you farewell until the next time. Everybody, you take care out there.